everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Menial No More, Advancing Our Workforce Through Digital Skills. My name is Allison Mullen. I'm the Manager of Communications and Marketing here at the Ontario Literacy Coalition. Before we get started, I just want to give you a few instructions. So at the right-hand side of your screen is your dashboard. There you can chat with each other in the chat pane and ask questions in the question pane. If it's a technical question you have during the webinar, I'll try and answer it and assist you throughout. If it's a question pertaining to the topic, feel free to ask at any time, and John will address them at the end of the webinar as well. And if you'd like to participate on Twitter, just use the hashtag OLCWeb. So now to introduce our presenter. John has a long and distinguished career in the literacy field, both in Canada and internationally. He was the founding executive director of the Preparatory Training Program, one of the largest community-based literacy programs in Ontario. He helped develop, initiate, and manage Metro Toronto Movement for Literacy's Information and Referral Service for Literacy and ESL, and was a founding board member of the Ontario Literacy Coalition. As Manager of Program Business and Partnership Development at the OLC, John MacLaughlin is leading a number of initiatives and applied research related to labor market development, effective program design, performance improvement, and accountability. His current and recent projects involve several initiatives relating to understanding skills, bias, technological changes in the labor market, creating effective service design for lower skilled adults, and examining possibilities inherent in career pathway models. So from there, I'm going to turn it over to John to take it away.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Menial No More, the paper, it was a paper that we released last October. And it was something that, frankly, I had done off the side of my desk as a way of trying to articulate to the community and to a lesser extent policymakers around some of the things that I've been seeing change in terms of workforce and workplace development and the skills associated with that development. Since that time, and for me, October seems like an awful long time ago, as I'm sure to many of you, we've learned an awful lot more. And the paper itself seemed to have struck a chord, as simple and as unresearched as it was. It clearly struck a chord with some program providers, with some other provinces, and with policymakers as well. Because since last October, it seems like I've been on the road a lot. I don't even want to tell you folks how many times I've given this presentation. But it's certainly been an evolving process, and we've learned a lot more since we put that paper out, whether it's been through emails or more in-depth research that I've done over the last 3 months. So bear with me while I go through some of the slides. I'm sure for those of you who've read the paper, some of it will seem familiar, and other things won't. So if I look back to our Workplace Literacy and Essential Skills projects, which the OLC coordinated for over 2 years, there was a number of things that came from those sites that really surprised me, right? As we focused on training in lower skilled positions in companies and for entry-level jobs. So what surprised us? First off, there is a significant disconnect between standard literacy and essential skills curriculum and workplace delivery. In every one of our sites, and we worked with 7 literacy and basic skills organizations, we had to modify the curriculum. All of the jobs in which we were doing training were undergoing dramatic skills-based technological changes, right? And by the way, get used to this phrase. It sounds like a mouthful, but it is part of the upcoming PX study, and we'll touch on this later. Right? Another important finding, the required job competencies were substantially higher than expected or what was listed under the National Occupation Codes. And in some of those, there was huge discrepancies, particularly in some work that was occurring in the mining sector, but also in such simple things, or seemingly simple, such as hospitality, right? That the kinds of changes and skills that were being driven by technology were not necessarily reflected in the codes. What do we also see? That learning gains on a standardized assessment may not have been captured, right? And so we used a range of different tools dependent on the site. In some sites we used TOWS, the Test of Workplace English. In other cases we used PDQs. In other cases we used camera. So we used a whole variety of different tools. And yes, there was some gains, but not what we necessarily would have expected, or so minor as to be statistically insignificant. Right? Many of the employers that we were in were projected to have labor supply issues. And once again, we'll come back to this. Right? Many of the jobs that we were in did not require a high school diploma. So, more recently, sort of following up on what we've heard about labor shortages or what employers are looking for, the recent report from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce identified a desperate labor shortage, and we're seeing this in a number of sectors, and resolving it is a key to continued success of Canadian businesses and the economy, right? And sometimes we think, oh my goodness, we have a high unemployment rate, or certainly not where we want it to be. But in certain communities, even in this province, I've been, I think, now to most parts of Canada, or talked to most parts of Canada about Menial No More, and it varies on a community-by-community basis. It varies by an industry-by-industry basis. And many of these jobs or job openings are not in the high-skill, high-tech sector that we so often look at. Right? I'm going to quickly go over this because it's a hard chart to entirely understand. But as I looked at how Canada fares, we look at unemployment rates across OECD countries. And Canada's doing very well in terms of labor force attachment of those with a university degree. We're also doing very, very well when it comes to those with a tertiary or community college diploma. We're even not doing so bad when it comes to those with just a high school diploma. But of OECD countries, when it comes to those without a high school diploma, we're doing very poorly. Right? So in fact, basically what it works out to is that the person without a high school diploma is twice as likely to be unemployed as compared with someone who does. Right? It's actually over 50% higher. Right? As I said, how are we doing with labor force attachment? Right? So if you compare OECD studies, we're third for university degrees, college or tertiary, seventh, high school or less, we're 44th. Right? So that's one part of the equation. That's a real challenge. Right? But it's also about technology. So how is it changing the lives of lower skilled workers? Right? How is it changing their work or opportunities for employment? How is it changing training? How is it changing the definition of literacy and essential skills? Because one thing for sure, it's more than just computers. Right? So when we're sort of going through Menial No More, in December, a report came out from the OECD. And for a while there, I thought I was the only person who was talking about how technology was radically changing lower-skilled jobs. Right? And there was a large study that came out from the OECD, written by Philip Toner, which noted that game-changing forces are at play in Western countries. Right? Jobs which were previously required low skills attainment are being filled by people who have a range of science and technology skills. Right? And this isn't just at the higher end of the job spectrum or even in the middle side of the job spectrum, because there's an awful lot of studies about those. But people have not looked in any great detail about how it's affected jobs, whether it's in retail or hospitality, the jobs that too often go unexamined. Right? And the best way to think about it, and I always do this because it's something that I do every day, I go to a shop to buy a coffee. And so 10 years ago, really to be a barista or serve a cup of coffee, there wasn't very much skill involved aside from being pleasant and being able to prepare coffee. Well, next time you go into certainly a Starbucks, you'll see it completely changed. But even, say, somewhere like Country Style, the computer systems that they're now on and the responsibilities of the person behind the counter have undergone really quite radical changes. Another example, we were just out in Nova Scotia 2 weeks ago, and I was getting ready to make this presentation. And so we were trying to set up our projector and, put in the computer key and get the PowerPoint ready. And the caretaker was trying to figure out how to actually get the Wi-Fi connection going. And, as he told us, a week before that, he wasn't responsible for doing that setup. They actually had to bring someone in. But now, within that particular city in Nova Scotia, it was the caretakers who were responsible for setting up fairly complex audio-visual equipment. This guy then proceeded to tell us about how radically his job had changed. Right? So one of the sort of, I wouldn't call it confusing aspects of this is, but, over the last 6 months, I'm sure we've all heard an awful lot about digital literacy. And it's certainly a priority of the federal government, the province as well. And I've had an opportunity, because I've been involved in an awful lot of forums, to more closely understand what does it mean by digital literacy. And I think for the most part, what the term is, the meaning that commonly resides with that term seems to be primarily about social media and personal digital activities. And there's been a number of papers about this. And as you look at the papers, you see an awful lot of information about tweeting, Facebook, and, I don't need to go over all the familiar faces of programs. Right? And yet, and I've been fairly explicit in my commentary about this, that wasn't the kind of digital skills I was seeing utilized in the workplace, or not particularly the workplaces that I've been in. Right? When we first put out Menial No More, we started to talk about STEM, but we knew it wasn't quite right. Right? Which STEM is a term that's often utilized in the United States and Great Britain to describe an enhancement of basic skills, right, where science, technology, engineering, and math are equal partners in reading and writing. I'll jump right down to the bottom. Is skills bias technological change has been a fairly common word in the lexicon of labor market development for about the past 7 or 8 years. And what it looks at, it's basically economic research that examines how technology is affecting changes in industry and, in turn, the impact on various job requirements. Okay? Now, we're going to get to the very catchy and fun phrase of complex problem solving in technology-rich environments. It's Actually, there's a few more words there. I simplified it for everyone. That is the element that the new PX study, the sort of newer version of IELTS, which will be coming out in March 2013, is examining. And it plays a critical role in how they examine how workplace skills are being used within the context of reading, writing, math, and to a lesser extent science. So while this may be one of the first times you're hearing that actual term, get used to it. And so what does it that necessarily mean, right? About the interplay between technology and literacy. And I'm not going to go into it a lot of time. And once again, if people ask me for some more information, they can send me an email and I'll send it back out. Right? But basically what it says is you just don't learn technology. It's the impact that technology has on reading, writing, math, etc. And the kinds of tasks and problem solving that is required in the immediacy that is required through technological devices. And I think since many of us have BlackBerries or iPhones or devices that get messages, and think about the way in which that changes your work. And then you'll have an understanding about how that has actually changed other people's work. And we saw this a lot in the hospitality industry, where people, whether they were on the food line or preparing food, or hospitality workers, or even room attendants, were required to make lightning-fast decisions based on a handheld personal device. So it wasn't just about responding, but it was about responding quickly and responding in a certain kind of language. Once again, I'll send out more of this information, but PX then in turn divides out technology in different ways, from hardware to software, commands and functions, and representations. So one of the things I get asked is that recently it's like, well, if you're concerned about all this, John, it's really a very small portion of the population you must be talking about, of those without a high school diploma. Well, across Canada, it's about 2.2 million working age Canadians, or about the same as the population, a little under the population of Alberta. Right? That it's not an insignificant number. And as we come into labor market shortages, right, it's going to become increasingly important to examine how we get these folks, or a higher percentage of them, and we've already talked about that we've not done a great job about integrating non-high school graduates into the system. That we need to find ways of getting them into the labor system and moving through employment. Oh, well, not just through, but moving up the employment chain. And it's a key element now in several provinces who are encountering rather severe, what I would call them early leaders or early indicators of labor market shortages. And whether it's in Saskatchewan or Alberta, we obviously know about it, but it's very critical in Saskatchewan. And I was talking to them a couple of weeks ago. And it's now a priority of the government. How do we not only get these folks involved in the labor market, how do we up the numbers, and how do we make it part of a progressive, ongoing system to get them employed and then support them as they move throughout employment? Okay. I'm just going to go over that. So who are the 2.2 million? Right? How do they participate in the labor market? Well, we know that in Canada it's not really strongly. Right? So something is changing. Right? As we've talked about, we've got the underrepresented labor pool, we've got technology, and more technology. One of the things is I do sort of want to talk a little bit more about this, is sometimes people will say, okay, yes, I've looked at that job, but actually only about 10% of the job, mostly it's manual labor. But only 10% of the job is really spent utilizing technology. The challenge is if they can't do that 10%, they can't do the job. And in some cases, it's really important. So if we looked at, say, the food processing industry or logistics, both of which are jobs or what I would call sort of industry clusters that are not only in need of employees but have projections of very large labor shortages in the near future, they are trying to come to terms with, well, yes, most of the job is manual. It's lifting or it's preparing stuff. But because of health and safety legislation and emerging kinds of technology, a larger and larger portion of their job is specifically related to technology. An example of that is in logistics is radio wave technology, right? In which they have to scan everything and they have to know where it comes from and where it needs to go. All again in lightning speed. Right? So we know it won't be the same. Required skills have changed. Employers expect more, and we all know that. Here's an interesting thing. We expect more. And by we, I mean customers. Right? For all of these industries, right? The reality is I often sort of get waylaid, or we get waylaid on topics of globalization, a range of other issues that frankly probably go beyond my understanding or the parameters of our work. But what I can examine is that people who go into stores or people who rent hotel rooms or people who line up in cafeterias simply expect more. And survey after survey of customers indicate that people want things faster and they want them better and their health and safety understandings are so much greater. There's a very large movement throughout all of Canada. Sobeys, Loblaws have all signed up to various versions of global food standards. And that is customer driven. Why is it customer driven? Because people want to know that their foods are fresh. And every single employee of Loblaws is required to ensure that products are fresh and that they know where they come from. So, during our work, we decided to examine what's occurring elsewhere, what seems to be working elsewhere, what are some interesting things that are occurring not only in Canada, in Ontario, but also abroad, right? What is occurring in some of those other OECD countries around training that they've been able to up the rates and progression of those people who don't have a high school diploma or have been able to engage those from what I describe as an underutilized labor market pool. Right? So, boy, it didn't take long to find it. In the U.S., and last year alone, the U.S. Federal Department of Labor invested $1.5 billion into career ladders. This is under the Pathways Out of Poverty initiative, which started out of the basic skills movement. And even with the challenges in the American economy, in Obama's State of the Union address, he made a point to talk about career ladders and the success of career ladders, not only in moving people into employment, but moving them along a system. And the system is a fair bit different than what we see in Canada, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Right? Many in the American Midwest, 4 different states came together to create Shifting Gears. And Shifting Gears is, once again, a career ladders type activity that examined trying to integrate basic skills, literacy and language training, with skills training. And the data from those projects using control groups has been very positive, right? So that they've been able to do things in a way that provided a clear sight line to employment for the participants. Jobs for the Future, which is the American college movement, which has done a really good job of, again, using career ladders to get people into the college system and provide opportunities for folks without a high school diploma to earn and learn at the same time. iBest, which is the granddaddy of them all, or grandparent, I guess, was started in Washington State. And iBest offers a range of programs that integrate basic skills and skills training. And one of the interesting features of that is you actually have to fail to get into iBest. Right? So if you test over a grade 9 level, you don't get into it. If you test under, then you do. And iBest, when compared with other programs, when it was first going, when it was compared to other sort of forms of remediation of literacy and language delivery, did substantially better. And now, 7 years down the line, the earnings of participants are substantially stronger. Right? In Australia, they've started skilling Australia, particularly working in the resource sectors, where they provided, or what they did is they didn't match. They, instead of looking at sort of a traditional education system, they gradated certificates based on a career path. Right? So if you look at mining, they start off at a very basic level and move it up, right? So that the certificates are not geared to specific institutions or specific models. They're actually geared to industry. In the UK, and there was an interesting report, because often many of us have always thought that the Skills for Life initiative in the UK was the quote-unquote gold standard. But over the past year, we've begun to wind it down. Because, in fact, as they started to look at control groups and comparison groups, while people were feeling good about their training, as they examined the data in more detail, the actual economic impacts for the participants were negligible at best. So as they started to examine things, and I suggest in December, the UK released a significant research and position document that started to talk about formulating basic skills delivery around industry standards, particularly for those who had employment goals. So, we have an opportunity to think differently about basic skills and training. And while I won't get into tons of this now, right, I think that it may be time, and for those of us who look back on literacy and essential skills, it was, by now it's almost 15 years old, that particular framework. And maybe we need to adapt what we're doing in the kind of real-time way that people's jobs are changing. Right? So if technology has radically altered a whole range of jobs, and as I say, I think we now see a very, very compelling case about how technology has changed jobs at the entry level or lower skilled position, that maybe we need to start to examine how literacy and essential skills is not only delivered, but what is encompassed within that particular framework. And is there an opportunity to examine how to integrate technology, complex problem solving, and industry-specific knowledge? Basically build on the things that we've seen working elsewhere. Right? Because whether it's in the Australia or the variety of programs across the state, there are some fairly common principles. Again, so as I started to look over in rather excruciating detail, the data around where might there be some promise around integrating literacy and essential skills, or literacy and basic skills, with technology and vocational skills. Well, we talked a little bit about food processing, and that's a very interesting industry. It's one of the largest industries in the province, and it's undergoing radical change. And one of the things is I know many of us saw the layoffs that occurred in Maple Leaf, and actually I think this was part of a column in the Globe Mail on the weekend. Now, while there was some layoffs, it was actually the industry, Maple Leaf, just simply changed, right? They closed their old plants down, amalgamated them into a single plant with a whole new range of technology. It wasn't just about productivity, it was also about safety. E. coli, you can all imagine, a very big issue for Maple Leaf Foods. Right? And the jobs are changing. They're still returning and looking to the same places to where they got employees before, but they're looking for different sets of skills. And we've had very long conversations with the food processing industry. They're not sure at this juncture what is required to work in that industry, but there is opportunity. As you look at what they do, the reading and writing skills, they're not really, really high. But the interplay with technology and those reading and writing skills is quite high. Retail and wholesale. Again, it's an industry which we're all familiar with because we all go shopping. And if you haven't been to Toronto or to the Apple store in the Eaton Centre, go take a look, because increasingly more and more stores are moving to that. And in fact, when Target opens up in Canada about this time next year, Target will actually look more, as they integrate new technology, more like the Apple store than it does like, say, the Bay or Sears or all the other companies that are encountering rather significant financial problems, right? That the person behind the desk or behind the counter, they want to get them away from that counter, right? They want to get them to using tablets, full range of other activities. And we talked to the fine folks at 7-Eleven, right? So even 7-Eleven, within several years, will change the way in which the store feels, looks, and its employees act. Right? It's also an industry that, as it looks down, especially for larger retail organizations, is seriously starting to wonder where their next generation of employees will come from. They examine many of these companies in the past have primarily got their employees as either recent high school graduates or college or university students. They can read the numbers. They know that those numbers are dropping between 7 and 8% every year. Okay? And yet the retail sector is one of the fastest and largest growing, not only in the province of Ontario, but throughout Canada. Where are the people going to come from? Non-regulated healthcare. Right? And it's actually one of those industries where we don't have any data. Right? All the rest of these sectors, we can get tons of data, but no one knows, because no one keeps track of things like nursing homes. Right? And as that data starts to come in, and we've had these conversations, right, there is a lack of certainty around the skills that are required or how people actually get those skills. Logistics and supply chain, one of the fastest growing industries in Canada, and it's everywhere. And in some areas of even this province, there are labor market shortages. And that really is one of the jobs, which 90% manual labor. But it's that portion in the interplay with technology that is critical, because one mistake can cost tens of thousands of dollars. And I think it's also interesting to note that currently 60% of the jobs in this sector do not require a high school diploma. It is an industry that is struggling to figure out what are the actual skills and competencies required. Mining. Again, as you talk to mining companies, they are very much struggling to figure out, again, where their next generation of employees are going to come from, and are remarkably amenable to trying to ascertain how to get groups who've not normally been part of the labor market involved. Right? Thinking in a very progressive manner, because they've got huge job openings in the next 2 to 3 years. And well, you're saying, well, that's 2 to 3 years, or 4 years, or even 5 years away till some of these things get fully developed. But if we want to start to provide opportunities for underutilized segments of our labor markets, we probably, and if we want to get them involved as a method to supply that particular labor market, we need to start thinking about that now, not when, say, Ballet posts on a board for jobs, right? Because if they start posting for those jobs and we haven't done that type of training, it's too late. Hospitality and tourism. And this is one area where there has been some really good work done. And OTEC, the Ontario Tourism Education, I always forget what that stands for, but OTEC is it's Provincial Sector Council. And they've set up career ladders and have done some remarkably good work, particularly as it relates to the Canadian language benchmarks, and have provided integrating training in the workplace. And it is something that could probably be emulated and replicated on a wider basis. Right? Now, while it's been done in the second language community, it's not been something that has been fully explored in the literacy and essential skills field. Manufacturing seems like an odd one, but in some parts of the province, manufacturers are actually looking for employees. Right? In other areas, you've got huge layoffs. We also know that it started to rebound, and that employers over the past 2 years in the manufacturing sector have invested more money than any other industry in Canada. While the jobs, to the same extent, will never entirely return, we can even see in U.S. job numbers that manufacturing is leading the way. Also of note, it has and had the highest age, or median age, in terms of its workforce. It is an older workforce, and it is a group of industries that will increasingly have to start to look for employees. Once again, probably not this year, probably not next year, but in the coming years. And say there was an article in today's Globe and Mail that talked about, you know, while manufacturing in terms of employment numbers has probably never returned, it's actually producing as much now as it did in the past. It's just more productive. I think we're also aware of what the current fiscal restraints that are facing virtually every province, including Ontario and the federal government. Right? We also understand the impetus to move people off of income support. Right? We also understand the impetus in terms of clients. And I was part of a larger study that talked to social assistance recipients about what they wanted. Right? It was quite surprising, the results, that many thought that social assistance recipients would actually ask for, say, a larger stipend, right? Larger form of income support. But no, actually, number one with a bullet was actually getting a job. It wasn't training, it wasn't housing, it wasn't a range of other things. It was actually about getting a job, right? And as we look to studies in the U.S. where they examined what welfare recipients wanted, yeah, no, they said the same thing. We want a job. Right? But what there really needed to be, for in other words, for it to be effective, was that there had to be clear sight lines to employment. The reality, most people don't participate in something just because it either, just for the sake of participating. They want a clear sight line to a job. And one of the interesting things out of Fast Track in Minnesota, which is a very successful program in terms of dealing with underutilized labor pools, was that participants, and it was an integrated basic skills with manufacturing or agriculture, a whole range of different skills, was that they actually could see a job at the end of it, right? And that every one of these sites in Fast Track or IBEST actually requires the participation of an employer, either in helping to develop the curriculum or in terms of providing some additional space for the training or an injection into a program of technology. And one of the things that became an underlying principle of all of the American projects and now in Australia as well is to try and think about further, faster, better, particularly for those who are the most vulnerable in our society. So if we look at the top bar, and this isn't my favorite graphic that we have, but in terms of what does a clear sight line to employment? Well, if we look at the top bar, right, we try and look at industry-led LES training, right, and employment. And then we look below, right, and this has always been, you know, and I can remember all of my years, and I think I've taught in a college, a school board, and led a community-based group, right? It was always very hard to describe to a client, particularly for those of us who are in literacy and basic skills, what the attachment to employment was, right? Often when we focused on employment, we actually ended up talking about the skills you needed to find a job, not to keep a job, or the kinds of skills that actually an employer was looking for. Right? And instead we talk about other systems, right? So creating pathways, right, that involves a multitude of providers. Right? So in a strange way, we're asking the most from people who often have the least, right, to navigate through a system which is, and I'm sure we've all been part of so many mapping projects that our heads would spin. Right? I think what we saw, particularly when it came to IBEST in Washington, was they went, well, you know what? We shouldn't be mapping. We should be creating programs with clear sight lines to employment so that people don't, the most vulnerable, don't have to move from program to program. Right? So how do we elevate Canada's entry-level workforce? And I want to leave time for some questions. So this is an example of the Career Pathways model. One of the key features of what we see occurring in other jurisdictions is an industry-driven approach. And once again, I can talk more about this offline, right? That our system is very supply-oriented. So that if we look at our training, and I was on a committee here in Toronto, we look at what most providers in our system is geared towards. Well, frankly, it's geared towards the supply side. That we look at programs and creating learners, and learners come out of programs. That's supply. Right? And we very rarely talk to the demand side, which is employers. Right? What do they want? What do they need? What do they require? And so what have we learned? Well, yes, we've learned in the States and in other jurisdictions they're actually moved to this. And they moved to this a while ago. And the general principles of an industry-driven approach is it has to be done regionally, and it has to be done with industry clusters, right? Because in even larger communities, industries gather around each other. So as we were looking at Target down in Cornwall, right? There's going to be about 20 other specific industries that pop up that are related to servicing the Target warehouse there. What are their demands? What are their needs? And that's a really critical element of economic development. So, how does that affect literacy and basic skills? Well, if we take a look at a traditional basic skills model design, right? You develop literacy and essential skills, or literacy and basic skills, as a foundation to move on to other things. Right? As we look at what's occurring elsewhere, right, that's showing to be effective through data, right? Particularly with students or learners or participants who have multi-barriers to getting employed. Right? We take a look at that and we see that there's, instead of occurring separately, they occur together. Right? So if we look at how things occur in traditional model design, well, you learn to do, and then you move on up. Right? We know that in more effective models that adults do to learn. And that means hands-on vocational skills, utilizing the kinds of technology that they're going to encounter in the job, or what's often now described in a number of jurisdictions as just-in-time technology. Right? So ultimately, at the end of the day, right, say, I like to think that I'm a thinker and not a knower. But we see some common elements in those jurisdictions where things seem to be working. Well, we know that these models are regional or local based, and they're based around industry-specific activities. The final thing that we see as common is they're not systems that are designed for the people who have the most resources. Right? They aren't the kinds of programs that are going to encounter people who are likely to have success anyway. Right? Instead, it's specifically geared for those without a high school diploma. Right? So as my final note, just because sometimes people sort of raise this question and say, oh yes, it's all very well and good, but it's not possible, John. Well, I will finish this off with the same retort that I have every time. We know it's possible. Why do we know it? Well, we know it because it's occurring elsewhere. And it's occurring in systems that are spending less money on education and training for the people with less than a high school diploma than we are, with better results, taking people further, faster. Now, Alison, I'll turn it back over to you, and people can give me a few questions. I think we got like 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks, John.
I'll have a big gulp of coffee because I didn't have a chance.
Yes, if you do have a question for John, I really encourage you to go to the questions pane there and ask one in the about 9 or so minutes that we have left here. I do have one here for you, John, from back a bit ago. Of those 2.2 million working age Canadians that do not have a high school diploma, do we know how many are Aboriginals?
Yeah, we do. I don't have those right at my fingertips, but I do have that data, and it was not an insignificant portion.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and if the person, Allison, wants to send me an email, I have all that data.
Okay. Yeah, so John, if you want to, John is the person who asked the question. If you want to contact John there through the email, we'll make sure to get you that information. He says he'll be sending you an email. What's the role of, how do we get business involved in this conversation and industry in this conversation?
Right. That's a really good question. Well, first off, the way we get business and industry involved, it can't be just putting their name on a website, right? I mean, because too often, and I've been, as guilty or more guilty of that in the past, not recent past, right, of getting involved, an employer involved in a committee, etc., getting them to come to a meeting or whatever. As we've learned, as America particularly examined the Pathways Out of Poverty initiative, that has pretty small returns. Instead, what they've learned is that relationships with employers have to be authentic. And by authentic, that means getting them involved in curriculum design, getting them to deliver part of the training, right? And there's a number of ways in which that is done, right? Committees are not one of them, right? As they examined that, going to groups of employers, right, or focusing some funding that directly meets an employer's needs does pay dividends, right? So instead of just asking them for their name, but actually asking them to come on site and teach, or in many cases, particularly Wisconsin, where actually getting the students on site as part of, a training program where it's delivered. And there's a great example in Wisconsin where part of the training, 1 day a week, actually occurred in John Deere. Right? It was interesting. Almost everyone there got a job in John Deere. So it created a different dynamic with the employer, where it actually created a pipeline, right? Particularly for employers who have labor market shortage projections in the not too distant future. And luckily enough, or unluckily enough, probably within the next 5 years, that counts for all industries.
Okay, we have a few more questions here. There's a few here actually asking about kind of a rural versus urban approach. In rural areas, what do we train towards when there are few opportunities for work?
Right. The rural-urban issue, which is a piece that I've just started to examine in more detail. It's, I think that I'm going to call Menial No More as Menial No End. Clearly, the divide between the issues of what I would describe as large urban centers, medium-sized centers, right? On the middle range of cities and towns, and rural and remote communities. Each are different, right? And I think that we'll be coming out with a piece in the not-too-distant future that tries to articulate which of those, so which models work where, and the involvement of employers and differently and how. Because in some rural communities, there's actually huge labor market shortages. In other rural communities, there really is a surplus on the demand side. So it's not just a rural and urban thing. It's a very complex issue, right? But once again, it very much depends on the kind of industry that is in your community. So that's basically a non-answer sort of answer, but one that I hope to be more fully articulating in the next several months.
Okay. Another question. John, I think you're saying that the current model in Ontario has an overly academic focus. How do you envision change happening? What do you think this means for programming as we know it in Ontario? This is an easy question for you.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that it is overly academic, and I think that the OALCF was a fairly remarkable step forward in trying to create a framework towards goal paths. But what I would say is this, and you know, obviously we live in really challenging times, is that we sort of haven't broken down the boundaries between work and training. We haven't even actually broken down the training, the barriers between a range of different kinds of training, whether it's like language, literacy, etc., and skills training, right, and post-secondary. I think that what we've learned elsewhere is, and obviously this is a longer-term challenge, right, is that we maybe need to start to think about different alternatives for learners with employment goals or who need to move to employment more quickly, right? If you think about many of those people who don't have a high school diploma or are vulnerable or their labor force attachment is weak, really time is of the essence, right? If you're a single mom, probably the chances are you can't spend a long time on social assistance. So how do you build your skills, become employed, and then earn and learn at the same time? Well, industry-led or industry-oriented certificates probably is what we learned is working elsewhere, right? So that certificates and diplomas revolve around an industry. It doesn't revolve around the funding system, right? So if we think about in Canada, well, you've got the LBS system, then you move on to this, and then you move on to that. It's very institutional-oriented or system-oriented. Instead of, so it's very focuses on the supply side. Instead of focusing on the demand side, wrapping certificates around clusters so that people can earn and learn at the same time. This is the lesson of career ladders. This is the lesson of jobs for the future. This is the lesson of shifting gears and iBest, right? So that the moment someone leaves the program to go to work, the system doesn't leave them. It doesn't leave industry. It doesn't occur outside of economic development, right? And what is the most important reason for doing that? Is because of the long-term economic impacts on our most vulnerable. And maybe as I always try and finish this up, is one of the things I most commonly hear is, oh yes, this is too big, this is going to be too hard, right? And that, or John, what you're talking about is, oh my goodness, you're actually training people in the ways in which an employer should be training these folks, right? Well, for me it becomes a little bit of a dilemma, right? In which the most vulnerable in our society, we say, no, we can't give them vocational skills because that's the job of employers, or that's the job of private vocational colleges, right? Well, to me it seems that our public institutions shouldn't leave the most vulnerable to employers to do the training or to private vocational colleges. It seems when it comes to this group that we need to turn our attention and our resources to, in fact, the most vulnerable, to their needs, to their characteristics. Right? The good news out of that is, strangely enough, we're hearing the same thing from employers as well, right? Almost every employer I've talked to, or employer group, has said, John, tell us about how we can get the underutilized individuals in the labor market more fully involved in our industry cluster, right? So far, the primary challenges I've faced is either come from the system itself, right? So I think this is our opportunity. This is our time. This is the moments that we can start to think about providing skills that go further and faster for the most vulnerable in our society.
Okay, we're just past 2 now, so unfortunately we're going to have to end it there. There are a few questions remaining, but I'll be sure to keep note of them, and then hopefully maybe, John, we can answer them over email.
Yeah, if people have other questions, Allison, even though I'm heading out over the next few days for other meetings, people send me an email. I'll try and send as pithy an answer as possible, although pithiness is never my strength.
Okay, that's great. So if you'd like to email John, his email is john@on.literacy.ca. So thanks, everyone. I have note of your questions that we didn't get to here, and we'll try to answer them via email. And thank you, John. Thanks. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.